Today we want to address, I really don't want to, an area that I'm convinced is probably the greatest commandment, and it's one that I think all of us probably are guilty of breaking. And yet it's one if we keep, all the others will fall in place. We heard it alluded to today in the first reading when they was talking about how these businessmen are using the Sabbath as a way of taking time to figure out how to better cheat everyone else during the week. And so it talks about the Sabbath. And if you heard in the opening prayer, it's about loving God with all your heart, and then, of course, loving your neighbor. If we don't love God, we're not going to love our neighbor. That's not really possible, because God is love. But how do we love God? And in what practical ways are we called to show that? The Sabbath, in a way, summarizes that for us. If we look at God's gift, and the Sabbath was a gift. You have to think about people in general throughout the world. People have always worked 7 days a week. There is no time off. And so the first time we ever see the Sabbath, I'm not sure if you're aware of that or not, is when Moses seeks to bring the people out of Egypt. If you remember the story of creation, we saw only an allusion to the Sabbath, and more the Sabbath comes from. That is, God created the world in 6 days, and it says then on the seventh he rested. And so it's from that seventh that all the Sabbaths come from. And so what was going on in that seventh day? Well, when you look at it, Adam and Eve were enjoying the Sabbath permanently. They were in paradise. They were in God's presence. They walked in the cool of the evening with the Lord. So in other words, all of their existence was really with an awareness that God was truly part of their life. Every day was the Sabbath because they were in the Sabbath. Then, of course, they sinned and said, we're going to work. They picked the one fruit that God said don't do. That was work for them at that time because it was a forbidden fruit. And then what happened? He said, now real labor comes in. They were working before, but now it takes on a different meaning. Because if you want to work, you want to do it by yourself, then see what it's going to take. And so from there up to the time of Moses, that's all man knew, was work 7 days a week. And that's the dialogue, if you ever catch it with going on between Pharaoh and Moses. Remember Moses had to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And what was that? He wasn't asking for him to go totally away from Egypt to start with. It was, let my people go a 3-day journey into the desert so that they might worship our God. Start looking at the math there. 3 days journey up, we're going to worship God. He's going to show us what to worship with. And then 3 days journey back. That's going to be 7 days. So one of the 7 days is for the gift of worship. And if you notice, what was Pharaoh's answer? Put him to work. Give him more work to do, labor. Give him more work to do. And his focus is so much on work, then what do we find? 7 days later. In the Bible, 7 days is always a reminder of God's covenant. 7 days later, God starts a series of pretty serious afflictions for the Egyptians. If you remember, the river turning into blood, and the locusts, and all kinds of stuff. But what was it doing? It was attacking their business, attacking those things that they depend on for livelihood. In other words, if you think you can make a living, same thing he was showing you with Adam and Eve. If you think you can do it on your own, you get out there and try it without me. And so now he's showing Pharaoh it's not about working. My people have to have 1 day out of 7 for worship. Okay, then we go through a long break period of time. We say, how does that become incorporated with Moses? Again, that's where the 10 Commandments came in, wasn't it? God gave him the 10 Commandments. One of those commandments is that we are called to keep the Sabbath. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it said that there will be neither planting or harvesting on that 7th day. Neither one. Neither planting or harvesting. That's pretty serious. And yet we can start seeing what happens. And we keep falling into it. Throughout history, we seem to have this proclivity to want to do our own thing. And that's what Amos is warning them about. And we'll finish him shortly. It's like, okay, so the commandment was to take that day of rest. Why? Because we got to rest? No. Because we are, as human beings, a people related to God. As a people, we are called to be part of God's creative powers. So when we work, it's because we share with God what he does. That's what it's about. So we are called to reflect on that. And in other words, Pope recently reminded us of that in terms of the care of the land. It reminds us that as human beings, we are of necessity of people who need time to reflect, the time to use the creative powers, the creative juices that God gives us, the arts. In other words, there's so much that God calls us to be and do that is not about fixing the next meal. Animals are concerned about that next meal all the time. Human beings are called to say there's something more to life than that. So God says, take one day out of the seven. Now, if you think that he had a problem with Pharaoh, guess what happens with the Jews when they leave Egypt? You notice how they complain? And when they complain, God said, okay, I'm going to give you manna. Now, you're going to pick that manna up 6 days of the week. On the 6th day, you'll gather enough for the Sabbath, so that you don't have to work on the Sabbath. And if you try to gather too much, guess what happened? It rotted. It's like, you're not going to get ahead of God. Yeah. And God spent one whole generation, 40 years about, teaching the people this habit, this way of life. Work 6 days, rest 1 day, work 6 days, rest 1 day. And you would think after 40 years they would get it, wouldn't you? They come into the promised land, the manna stops, and almost immediately they go back into that old cycle again. Well, if I just work 1 more day, if I work on the Sabbath, I can make more, I can get more. And so that's where we come up to Amos. Because what happened? Now God said, you will now be in captivity in Babylon for 70 years, so that the land itself might reclaim its Sabbath. See, the land was supposed to sit idle for a year, every 7 years. It too was called to be a time of rest. So we today might think about rotating crops, but in those days, they said no. 1 out of every 7 years is to lay aside. And if you don't do that, okay, you can go to Babylon for 70 years and see how you like that. God again and again keeps trying to teach us the importance, the necessity of taking that kind of time. Now, as we come to the New Covenant, the New Testament, what do we find? Well, we really find a new creation. We find a new creation in terms of like St. Paul says to us. He says, continue to come together on the day of the resurrection. Okay, that's Sunday. Continue to gather with the assembly. Do not forsake the gathering of the Christian assembly. That's Sunday. So we began to see how Christians gave God the first part of the new creation rather than the last. That you and I, as Christians, become more profoundly aware that we do share with God in His creation. And so when we look around us, we're called to stop one day and say, wow, look how God has blessed me. Look at what He's allowed me to build. Look at my house. Look at my family. Take time for family. Take time for friends. That's what the Sabbath is about. It's not really about, oh, good, I got a day here. Let me work double so that I can have fun and then have to take off Monday because I can't go to work and I'm too tired. Some people really overstress themselves trying to have fun sometimes, but it's really about saying, take time. Take time just to be. Take time to certainly worship God as you're doing now, but then with that, to realize as human beings, God created us for something more. And He created us to have an ongoing relationship with Him. And in that relationship, to say, okay, how am I doing? How's my family doing? What have I got to be grateful for? What gifts do I have that maybe my work doesn't bring out for me that I can use on the Sabbath and develop those, whether it's music or whether it's art or whether it's just being good to others or visiting sick neighbors. Those kinds of things become the kind of thing that defines us as human beings. And if we do that, then believe me, we really will keep the other commandments a whole lot better. So I'd encourage you with this Sabbath to take a moment to look and say, how are we doing? How are we doing? Are we using this day, this gift from God, in the way it ought to be used? Or are we simply saying, okay, God, I'll give you your 1 hour, but that's it. Are we looking at it as a chance to be with God, to be with family, and to be with friends? That's what it's for.